started. So it's a small crew today. We're going to see some people trickle in perhaps. Otherwise, we're going to send out the recording to everyone, whether you joined or not. And this is also going to be part of an upcoming podcast series called the Hiring Community Podcast. So keep an eye out for that. This episode should probably be aired next month. But while we have Rashonda here as one of our attendees, if you wanted to hop off mute, please feel free to do so. I see that you're actually off mute. If you wanted to introduce yourself, say hello, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Rashonda. I am a senior project manager here, you're not here, at OneTrust. I'm also a part-time ERG co-lead for Black at OneTrust. And so I've been spearheading ERGs for about 5 or 6 years now, and it just dawned on me that I'm good at it probably over the last 6 minutes. So I'm actually doing more research, looking at more networking community activities, hearing what people have to say, good, bad, or different from my own, to try to set myself up for being a practitioner full-time in the near term.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And that's a really great goal to have. And I'm glad that you joined. Definitely a conversation that's up your alley. I will also go ahead and share the link to the hiring community. So that's in the chat if you wanted to go ahead and apply. It's completely free to join. It's just, I like to make sure that the people joining are going to be adding value. I'm already going to let you know, I think your background just sounds great. But yeah, it's actually, here we go. I just sent it to you directly. But yeah, okay, so we are going to get started. Opal, I think it would be great if you gave a little intro of yourself, but I realize I haven't introduced myself, so let me do that. I'm Neha. I am the founder of the Hiring Community and a talent consultant. And I got to know Opal through the Swarm. That's a platform, a RecTech platform that's hosted a number of events, and they also host their own community in case you wanted to join that. There's plenty of great recruiting resources there too. And so the hiring community itself is mostly startup founders and recruiting leaders that are interested in leveling up their craft and learning how to attract diverse talent pools and also partner with HR on inclusive hiring and talent development strategies. So I'll hand it over to Opal to share a little bit about herself and her background.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for joining again. My name is Opal. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I got my start in tech by working at a small startup with coffee and robots, which is another story for another day. But working in downtown San Francisco, being like a Bay native, I always knew the richness and the diversity within this within the Bay, but seeing it in the tech industry, seeing that it's like up and coming, I was very fascinated by that. And so eventually when I started working at Flexport was when I became an ERG lead, kind of similar to you, Rashonda. I was like, goodness, what is this? I really kind of like this grassroots kind of feeling. I have a little bit of activism in my blood, I must say. And so coming together and cultivating community with folks in tech, underrepresented folks and all was something that really was a passion of mine. And so I took that down to Silicon Valley as well, working with founders and also underrepresented founders. I would say DEI is the core of my being and all that I do. And so now that's inspired me as a talent consultant and also as a birth worker. So I'll kind of put all of those dots together since I know it's a little bit all over the place, but I would say inclusion is definitely at the core of what I do. And it helps me connect with like-minded folks, including Neha. And so that's why I'm really excited to have this conversation today. It's definitely a full circle moment.
Thanks, Opal. Definitely full circle. And just reflecting on your time as an ERG lead, as well as through your consulting work, how can leaders show up to promote allyship?
I honestly think, taking it from the talent perspective, it starts at the job description, especially right now, as you know, there are a lot of mass layoffs and people are applying for jobs. I think we're a lot more aware of what the company's values and ethos are. And so if you can make that known on a job description, whether it's through your parental leave policies, whether it's through making sure that it's known that you have an ERG, and then inevitably through the through the interview process, just giving that transparency is really, really important. And so it starts at the JD, and then you can foster that internally, which is something we can dive more into, but it starts at the JD.
For sure, I think the initial communication with a candidate, and that's where recruiting specifically needs to be armed with the right assets, the right language, and really be doing their part in their communications, with the JD, but throughout the interview process as well. But in terms of leaders in particular, I know that, we know that it starts from the top. So I wonder, even posing this out to the audience as well, if you feel that you have some thoughts to share, please feel free to, chime in. This is more of a group discussion, small group discussion. But I wonder, Opal, are there, a couple of leadership traits perhaps that you would suggest people look out for as this is an ally, this is someone who's inclusive?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say it starts from the top. And so I think leading with transparency could start with storytelling. And so say if you have like a sit down with your CEO for them to kind of let you know their career story and see the ways that you resonate with it, and then setting up maybe a coffee chat. So making yourself available from the top down. And so maybe even having office hours. I know that I really enjoyed having coffee with our head of HR when I was at Flexport. And so it made them more human. I know that coming in as more of an IC, it can be really intimidating seeing all these people who, have these great career stories. It can be a bit intimidating, but if you bring yourself back down to earth and be like, hey, I'm human too. This is my story. This is my career journey. And this is how I can kind of help you become the best person or become the best employee that you can be, and championing that. I would say mentorship is also a huge thing. And so leaders need to kind of keep that understanding throughout as they live through their organization, to be like, hey, I'm human too. And these are the things that I go through, and this is how I can kind of help you through it. And so dropping gems is definitely something that I think that I would definitely appreciate, and I have appreciated in the past. So that's one of the major things.
Yeah. So I think it sounds like transparency, approachability, and being a strong mentor. Those three things are, good traits to spot in your leader if you're trying to assess whether or not they are an ally. And then moving on to painting a picture of what an inclusive culture looks like and why that matters. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say the ways that you can foster an inclusive culture is even by having conversations like these, like it's Black History Month. And so making sure that you ask your employee, not just assuming what the employees want, but maybe asking them through maybe a survey or maybe at like an all hands of like, hey, what would you like to see during these kind of themed months for to make sure that you feel included? And so and not necessarily making the onus fall onto, all of those said employees, but being like, hey, what would you like to see and how can we make that possible? And so that's something that I definitely appreciate. Being part of the conversation is, in and of itself is inclusion. And so that's something that I would definitely appreciate and have in the past. And that's important to let us know that we're heard.
Yeah, starting a dialogue, right? And having courageous conversations and making sure that you're including people in decision making and not making decisions for them.
Exactly.
And really getting to understand what matters to them during this month. And so there are, ERGs at companies that are focused on specific groups. And so I think, Rashonda, actually, you might have something to share here in terms of how your ERG is set up or structured. If you feel like chiming in, please feel free to do so.
Sure. So we represent Black employees across 2 regions. We have a UK office based out of London that has quite a large population of Black employees there. And then we have a Sandy Springs location in Georgia that has the rest of the corporation there. And so we have three leads, 2 US regional, 1 for UK, and then we have a chair leadership structure underneath. And so our chairs are broken up into impact areas and groups. So we have, internal impact, community, things like that. Then we have kind of internal development. We do community outreach and things of that nature. That kind of changes from year to year, depending on what our focus points are. But from out of those subgroups, we allow them to be individual contributors. And so my role as a lead there is really to spotlight and showcase all of those leadership capabilities that are coming into managing that. And so our leadership platform is very kind of chair-based, where we make sure that not only are we giving them challenging stretch opportunities, that we're also putting them in front of leadership, showing, how their skill sets transcend across the organization outside of just kind of revenue generating outcomes. So belonging is a really big part of our culture. Inclusion is a really large part of our culture. We try to bring as many allies into our group as possible. I think I will say, and then I'll wrap this up because I don't want to steal your show, but I do believe that we've made tremendous progress. Black at OneTrust has only been established for about 1.5 to 2 years now. And so we really started from the ground up, based off of kind of some very foundational work with the D&I Council. So we're very much kind of moving with the world on how we look at DEI as a whole, as a corporation. And I've been very, very fortunate to have a strong group of supporters from the executive level. And we've just kind of figured it out as we went along. I know that's not the popular answer, but we just pretty much pulled in kind of collective perspectives from all of our chair leaders who come from different parts of the organization, have their own different experiences, and pretty much like did trial by fire to some extent. Things that were successful, we said, great, let's try to duplicate it, make them better. Things that weren't successful, we kind of took back to the table. But yeah, I'm really, I think for those who are looking to build and establish for the first time, don't put a lot of pressure on yourself. Go with the resources that you have and the time, and just make do with what you can for now until you get something better.
That's amazing, Rashonda. And may I ask, did you know that OneTrust was such an inclusive organization when applying and ultimately accepting the offer? Was that something that drew you to them maybe over another offer? Or can you kind of explain that a little bit? Because that's fascinating.
I wish I could say yes. And partly, if I'm being completely honest with those on the phone call, I don't expect much from DEI from many organizations. I work primarily in the tech space. We have a lot of advances in DEI and that whole spectrum, as many setbacks and representation and things of that nature. And so I kind of take what people tell me at a very surface level, and so I can kind of get into the organization and see really what's happening at the ground level. Some of that comes from experience working it, and just regular employment mishaps and things of that nature. So no, I didn't go in thinking that it was a great company, thinking that I would come in and have all of these things in place. And it was as expected. It was horrible. It was really, really bad. We're talking about startup culture, and then just an international just thing, right, going on. So all of these complexities, and we're a privacy company. Yeah, and so add another barrier. We can't really kind of fudge on the privacy aspect of it and the data governance. And so now you add all these other kind of unique gotchas into the mix. So I won't say that this is the first organization that I've worked with that has some kind of compliant regulation type atmosphere, but I think that's something that leaders should go in when they are looking into like the new roles. Like, is there something in the making? Maybe they don't have it yet, but are they building? Are your recruiters comfortable talking about DEI and what is there and what isn't there? That's kind of what I look for now. Even if they say it's not like, hey, it's not great. Okay, then what are you guys doing? If anything. My goal is to get something, and follow up. That kind of gives me kind of a better strategy going forward. But no, when I came into OneTrust, no idea. And I just came at a pivotal time where all companies everywhere were looking at all of the impacts on social justice, and was able to build on momentum from that. And I think I'm fortunate in that respect. but it also made it a little bit more difficult because now there's accountability factors. So 2 years in, where are all those statements and what did you do with them? And
No,
I'm struggling through that too.
that makes complete sense. And so one perspective that, or I guess one context that I would like to build off of is the startup, like I guess startup versus like more enterprise level companies. One thing that I've realized and that I'm actually pretty proud of when working with early stage founders is that they're thinking about this early on. And that's something that I appreciate because as we know, the term like diversity debt, which I have my own issues with, but it makes sense for the conversation of startup leaders will kind of put the blinders on and do what they think works in the moment, and then later on realize like, oh gosh, we're not an inclusive organization. And so I would say, particularly after the summer of 2020, which we all know what happened, now founders are being held more accountable, not necessarily against their will because we want them to genuinely do this, but there is a more high level of accountability that founders need to do and a more of an awareness that founders need to have and bake that into the core of their team, whether it's seeing who's at their cap table, seeing who they include early on in the business. And so kind of to your earlier question, Neha, I think I wouldn't want to say easier, but I think it could be a little bit more widespread at the early stage level, opposed to like the mid stage or late stage. But it's still possible at those stages, but it's different when you have more people on your team. But earlier on, it can move a little bit differently, if that makes sense.
Right. So just setting, the intention early on and trying to really be intentional in terms of that culture you're trying to build and who you have on your leadership team early on is what I'm hearing, because that sets the tone for the culture moving forward. I do know that a lot of founders struggle in the early days because it's, a smaller team, that it's harder in some ways to get that kind of, diversity across the team. And, but I think what you're saying here makes sense, that like, trying to set those guardrails in advance is what's going to help, right?
100%.
Yeah. And when it comes to communicating, I think a lot of, inclusive culture and, your goals in terms of promoting diversity and hiring inclusively really boils down to communication. I mean, earlier on, you were even saying it starts with your job description and your employer brand and what are you communicating to the outside world. But thinking about communication, whether it's branding do's and don'ts when it comes to employer and consumer brands, what can you share with us there?
I would say it depends on where you're showing, what spaces you're showing up in. I would say to the earlier point of your job description, where are you posting your job descriptions? Where are you recruiting from? Of course, being in the San Francisco Bay Area, it's easy to get siloed into the Stanfords of the world, which is totally okay, but you're kind of cutting yourself off from a lot of different opportunities. And so where are you doing your tabling events? Where are you showing up for founder mixers or even promoting your brand? And so making yourself kind of more widespread than maybe just using the typical avenues of promoting yourself and the kind of message that you're putting across. Again, leading with that transparency is key to let folks kind of know, what they're getting into and what kind of company and where you are going to. And so if it's like, hey, we have a goal, being transparent about that goal and showing people like, hey, we might not be where we want to be, but we're hoping to be there, by Q2 or Q3. And if you join our team, let's make it happen. Again, the onus might not necessarily fall onto you to make that happen, but it's like we're open-minded and wanting to make that change. And so as long as you're transparent about that, I know that me as a candidate would be appreciative of that. Like, okay, they're getting there somewhere, but I hope that answers.
Yeah, so that willingness and that openness to try new things and to get it right and to be, open to correcting and, changing things. So that in itself, I think for sure candidates are excited about. And even if you don't have things set up, just opening up that, hey, we're open to change. We just haven't had a chance to get started on this, or, no one's really brought this up, but we are open and ready, and we will put some resources behind this, and we'll sponsor you or whoever it is in case, you know, you're not the person who wants to take this on, right? And we'll talk about that in a little bit, because that can sometimes lead to the tokenism trap. But, you know, what you mentioned around, you know, distribution, I guess. So making sure that you're advertising job ads across multiple channels and not sticking to your favorite spot that's worked for the past couple of years, or, you know, really trying to diversify where you're looking for talent rather than sticking to what's always worked, because that's where, you know, you could be ending up with this exclusive culture that, you know, is sort of like a club that no one else gets in, and that might be alienating some of your consumers. It might also be stifling innovation. It might also be keeping a lot of people on the team silent. And so there's this entire trickle down effect if you're not actually, you know, hopping out of your usual spots to find and hire talent.
100%. I'll add one more thing is using examples. If you see a company that, if you're an early stage company, you see more of a mid-stage company, and you're like, dang, I really like what they're doing. Maybe going up to them and asking, hey, how did you get to where you are? Because this isn't an overnight thing. I'm sure the company that you admire had their own pitfalls and made their own mistakes. And so if you connect with that founder or someone from that team and have a conversation and maybe even have an opportunity for mentorship in that way, I think it's good to, again, lead by example, because if you are trying to do this on your own, it's not going to work. I'll tell you that right there. And that's why community is so important. Going back to ERGs, this work is not meant to be done alone. The founder journey is not meant to be done alone. And so if you're feeling like, dang, I have these goals and these aspirations that I want to meet for my company, but I just don't know what the heck I'm doing, use your resources and make those connections. And you're going to be able to find that help, but closed mouths don't necessarily get fed, I would say in this instance. So that's my answer.
Thank you for that. I think that's so helpful to lean on your community and dive into some peer-to-peer learning. I think a lot of people are hesitant, you know, to share that they don't know the answer to things, but it's how we all learn is by asking and connecting with those who are a few steps ahead of us. So appreciate that.
100%.
And how can we drive meaningful organizational change through hiring? So we talked a little bit about looking at different talent pools, but in terms of, you know, org change, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, again, I would say it starts from that job description, but I would also say by making goals. We, of course, are going to talk about avoiding the tokenism trap. It's not about having the most colorful, you know, employee page, but I would say that your employees are your biggest cheerleaders. Those are the ones who can make referrals. And of course, referrals can make your organization a little too homogenous, but it can also diversify your organization. And so if your employees are happy, they're going to talk about it. They're going to be like, hey, I love working at company X because we have, you know, months where I feel seen. Right now we're celebrating Black History Month. And then later on, we're going to celebrate, you know, Women's History Month. And so making sure that your employees are happy, because they're the ones who are going to be having those conversations with people to ultimately make referrals. And so that's one of the biggest ways that I can think of at the moment. And so.
So this makes me think of a quote that I came across, and it's, inclusion is the goal, diversity is the outcome. And so if you're being inclusive in your hiring practices, you are by nature going to end up with a diverse team. And, you know, going back to what you said about looking at your happy employees, getting them to speak about
Uh-oh. 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 Oh no. Did I cut out? Uh-oh. 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 Can y'all still hear me? I think I might have.
And
Okay, I think it might be Neha's Wi-Fi. I was freaking out a little bit.
no, I can still hear.
Okay. Oh yeah, Neha just messaged me that it restarted out of nowhere. Okay, we'll take a pause for a quick second. But how is the conversation resonating so far?
Very much so for me. I think it's nice validation. One of the things that plagued me when I was kind of first getting into this was just like, am I doing this right? Is this what people normally do? Because I think you probably will find as well that diversity as a structure with processes and procedures is very new. And so there hasn't been a lot of best practice guidance that I've been able to lean on. And so it's nice to come to these types of activities and to hear other people who have had to go through some of the building blocks of getting into it and hearing that, kind of the same things like, yeah, you are doing it right, if there is such a thing.
And I think one of the most important aspects is holding space. Sometimes, when I scroll through LinkedIn and I have all of my DEI thought leaders, and sometimes it's like wagging your finger and it's kind of like the morality, police. It can be kind of scary. Like, okay, if I make one mess up, like my entire career is going to be, like shot down. And it's like, no, we're all learning. We're all here. If you make mistakes, we're going to hold space for you and be able to, correct those actions, but it's not about finger wagging. Mm-hmm. And so I think I'd love to hear more, Neha, about how you've seen the diversity, the DEI space shift from pre-June 2020 to post-June 2020, because I feel like ERGs and like DEI efforts weren't taken as seriously, if you will, post or pre-2020 as they are now. And so I've had my thoughts and feelings about that, but kind of what has been your perspective in that shift, even being outside of the US? I'd be curious about that perspective.
Totally. And it's an interesting point because 2020 kind of gave us this spotlight. It gave DE&I its spotlight, but then it also put every single person in that space, it put a spotlight on them. So, going back to your point around finger wagging, it's like anything you say or do, if you're not, speaking the right language, if you're not adhering to a certain set of principles, and if you don't share the same opinions, suddenly there's something wrong about your perspective, even though a lot of people are sharing from their lived experiences. And there is going to be some diversity of thought there, and we have to honor and appreciate that. Otherwise, what is the point of speaking up for diversity and, wanting to amplify Black voices or, South Asian voices, and being able to actually give minorities the space to be themselves and talk if they feel too afraid that they're not, suddenly aligning with their dominant group's perspective, right? So I appreciate you bringing in that point around finger wagging, but I think for the most part, this might not be the loudest voices, but certainly I think this is most people in the space, like you said, are empathetic and want to see you basically succeed. And, if you, let's say something that's not as inclusive or goes against the grain, I think, you'll find in your community, and I would want to maybe lean on Rashonda and her experience at Black at One Trust. Like, how do you manage diversity of thought within your group? And, how do you manage these instances where there might be some in-group conflict, if and when it even arises? If Rashonda's there, I'd love to.
I'm here. It took me a second. Well, I am fortunate enough to have allies have joined as cheerleaders. It's interesting to think nearly 2 years in that we haven't been able to get much more allyship, and that is where we've struggled. To some extent, we've had to posture ourselves as like, we promise We're not going to bear down on you with sadness and pain, which is common in and this is in the spirit of Black History Month, is kind of a common focal point. Everybody wants to focus on the struggle, whereas Black at One Trust this year decided to focus on contributions, specifically in technology. So we did an awareness campaign. We're still doing it. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we introduced to the organization Black contributors, Black technologists, which is important for us. So I don't know, to go back to my original point, not everyone on our group agrees with our approach. And even those who identify as Black, we still don't agree. We're not a monolith. So there's quite a few disagreements. We do take a fairly democratic process. We do kind of hear everybody's thoughts, and then we kind of force a decision. Don't want to say force, but we choose something. Because for us, momentum was kind of important to our group. Getting together, we talked about what kinds of things we felt were challenges to Black progress in the organization. And the feedback that we received is, we kind of move too slow. We get bogged down into the weeds, and that kind of delays our ability to move quickly with what we have and actually execute on things. And so out of that, we decided, even if we disagree, maybe we pause, but we come back to our next meeting with a decision. And that's allowed us to kind of include everybody's thoughts, put us in a safe space kind of environment where you can feel you have the psychological safety to back kind of the feedback that you're going to give, even if people don't agree with it. And then, we just help people arrive. And I will say fairly that still not everybody agrees when we arrive at something, but that's just kind of what you have to do with life. So that's been helpful to kind of keep the inclusiveness there. It's been helpful to make sure that we're giving people their ample time on the floor, and that we're taking perceived experiences of even, non-Black identifying individuals and incorporating that into our plan. It's worked out. So.
Well, I like that.
It sounds like you found a way to create this democratic process and be able to discuss and then unite behind a decision. And you found that it's really important to arrive there and to help people, even if they don't fully agree, to understand that they've been given a chance to speak their truth and that it was taken into consideration before making that choice. And so I think the more you're able to give people this opportunity to feel seen and heard, because ultimately that's what people are after. The decision itself might not be, as worrisome as that opportunity to simply be felt and, heard. So I think that's where community spaces and employee resource groups can be really successful, is being able to create that democratic process. Even if the decision itself might not be the top pick for any one person, they know that their contribution and their voice was a part of, or at least considered, right? And so, Opal, when thinking about nurturing a community through employee resource groups, I'd love to hear your take, maybe reflecting on your time as an ERG lead and some of the work that you're doing currently.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really appreciated about being an ERG lead was initially, I didn't even know I was going to become one. I think I was at Flexport for all of 5 or 6 months before they asked me to be a lead. And I thought that I was too junior at the time. And so reflecting on that now that I'm more mid-career, I think that that's important. I think ERG should include voices at all levels of the organization. That's why executive sponsorship is so important, because Rashonda, to your point, is sometimes stuff gets siloed. It takes a long time to execute it because maybe an ERG only has, juniors to mid-level folks, and it's getting it to leadership. As we know, getting leadership to return emails can sometimes be so difficult. And so if you have someone who isn't necessarily the representative per se, the one who only has the voice to speak to leadership, but having a direct voice into leadership's ear can also drive that. We just, that's just how it is. And so making sure you have representation at all levels is really important. Folks who are new to the organization, folks who have been there for a while. And to that end of the inclusion part, maybe people who have just joined the organization might feel like, oh, let me wait a few months before I join an ERG. But it's like, hey, maybe maybe having an ERG lead have lunch or coffee with a new recruit to kind of not necessarily, make them join your ERG, because, it's at will, but it's like, hey, making sure that, this is an available resource. This is what we do. And, if you're interested now, come to one of our meetings. If you're interested later on, that's also a thing. But making sure that every voice is heard and doing what you can.
I like that. I like that idea. Many companies have a new buddy program. And so this could be something that ERG leads can get their communities to actively participate in, because so much of any community is, the value of it is when someone new joins, right? And I think going back to what Rashonda was saying around involving allies, I think there's plenty of change that occurs when you have allies, welcomed into this space, not only taking their opinions into consideration, but then, it just creates this opportunity to create larger change across different teams and throughout the organization when you have that allyship and sponsorship. Also thinking about an ambassador program, depending on the size of your community, the size of your ERG. If you're a multinational ERG, having these opportunities to create a sense of leadership across your community members through an ambassador program. Maybe they get a little bit more involved with the new buddy program if you have one, or other, talent development opportunities that your HR team is working on actively. So I think that partnership with HR or people operations, if you have a people operations department, and your ERG leads, that is a really important relationship, because there's so much that the people ops team is already working on that just, I think, can amplify the work that ERGs are also trying to create or want to see more of.
Yep.
And sometimes those programs, people ops programs, they might lack a little bit of nuance. They might not take certain accommodations into consideration or certain world events into consideration. And so having your ERG lead sync with the people ops team regularly, or your head of talent regularly, ideally, if your head of talent could be a sponsor of your ERG, I think that really helps you. It also helps you unlock budget, I would say. So thinking strategically there and how you can be part of the larger framework rather than existing in kind of your own vacuum.
Yes, I am like screaming at the rooftops, because one of the things that I really appreciated while I was at Flexport was when I was on an interview panel, because I was on the recruiting team, I guess it was kind of a double whammy. But one of the things that would come up during the interview when I was interviewing candidates was like, what's one thing that you really like about working here? And I'd be like, oh, the ERGs. And they're like, whether, they've heard about it before and they wanted to know more, or they were like completely, didn't know what it was. I think that was like one of the selling points. And so having one of the things that that they had implemented at the time was having an ERG lead. If it was an opt-in, it was completely optional, but candidates could say, hey, I'd like to talk, maybe 15 minutes with an ERG lead. This isn't going to be part of the interview scorecard or anything. I just kind of want to know in earnest, what it would be like to be part of said ERG, because that could, make or break whether a candidate accepts an offer. And so because I was on the interview panel and in the ERG, again, I had to be very objective of like, okay, this person scored, this way, but, they were super interested in the ERG. I would kind of take those notes separately, if that makes sense. But the ERG, I would say that the ERG was definitely a selling point, if you will, during those interview conversations, which was why I took that feedback back to not only my recruiting team, but also to my ERG leads. And they were like, hey, what if we decide to implement this? And so I'm not sure how it stands to today, but it was definitely something that worked during our interviews. And essentially we would have new employees on day one sometimes come to our meetings. And so I thought that was really cool. And then they would mention like, hey, I talked to Opal during my process, she's the one she was kind of my buddy, if you will, talking about the system of like, I already knew, I felt like I already was a part of already. Not only am I excited to get my laptop on day one, but now I'm looking forward to,
Mhm.
the next ERG meeting. And so they feel that's the inclusion part right there. And so
Right.
that was kind of a unique thing that, again, I haven't seen it at other companies. Maybe Nathan,
Yeah.
you can say, but
Yeah.
I appreciated
So
it for sure.
a lot of companies will have a culture interview, and I think it's always interesting when you have an ERG lead as part of the culture interview. That could be one way to introduce them and the idea of ERGs to the candidate. And another thing that I've seen companies do is on the career site. So when a candidate is looking to apply for a job, if they're able to see, either pictures of ERG meetups or some stats on not just diversity, but some stats around what ERGs are accomplishing, what the different ERGs are, a bit of storytelling around what each of their place is, right? So I'm not sure if Black at One Trust has something like this for Shonda, but that could be a really cool way to showcase the amazing work that you're doing on the career webpage and let new hires know that we exist and this is what we do and this is how you can get involved and what to expect if you join the company.
100%. And so one more thing that I'll add to that is around parenthood. A lot
Mhm.
of parents are interviewing, of course, and they're like, hey,
Yeah.
I want to do what I can to, work, like I'll work whatever hours you need necessarily, but I have kids. And it's like, is that okay? Which I'm always like, yes, of course it is okay. We're
Mhm.
not going to ping you all night, but making sure that it's known like, hey, we have a parenthood ERG, for instance, or,
Right.
we're aware of the fact that, people are working and they're also
Mhm.
parents. And so saying that in the interview process of like, don't feel obligated to work, burn the
Yeah.
midnight oil, because we have an understanding and an awareness that folks are going to need to tend to their families after work. And so again, that transparency piece, I think, is something that
Mhm.
is extremely appreciated. And there's not necessarily one way to go about it. The parent example is just one of many,
Mhm.
but just being as transparent as you can about that.
For sure. I think the less a candidate has to ask about these different maybe hesitations that they have, whether it's, am I going to have enough time as a parent to manage my work-life balance, or am I going to see other people like me at this organization? The less have them worry about these things, the more opportunity you have to actually talk about skills and, career opportunities that, don't necessarily cloud some of the things that companies should just already have available ready to read. But of course, be ready as an interviewer to discuss these things if a candidate is bringing them up. Because it's one thing to showcase it on the career page and another thing for the interviewer and specifically a hiring manager to vocalize that as this is my team culture. Because something that we see oftentimes for job seekers in particular is there is this wider company culture displayed on the career page and maybe even through some Glassdoor reviews. But at the end of the day, you're spending most of your time with a specific team. And so the more you can get specific team leads as well to participate and understand how to create an inclusive culture on a micro level is where you're going to really be successful with the larger employer brand story.
100%. And even if someone isn't necessarily part of an ERG, but they can speak to the inclusion that they feel on their team, that can also be a selling point as well. And so making sure that, your department, I guess in our case, it was the recruiting department, feels like they can come together as well. For me, I worked on more of the G&A side of recruiting, but felt a little disconnected from the tech team. But it's like, hey, we come together, we talk about these things. It might not necessarily always be around DEI where with that happening in the ERG space, but it's like I feel included in various ways, not just as a Black femme in the workspace, but again, as a recruiter, I feel like I'm included. As, maybe a recent college grad, I also feel included. So making sure all the different facets of inclusion are being fostered within the space can be something that I think is a win-win for everybody on that front. And again, there's no one way to do it. It's just about asking your employees what they want and what they need and how we can make that happen.
Yeah.
And so just asking the questions in and of itself, people feel included, like, oh,
Yeah.
you want to ask me, kind of more, a mid-level person? Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
That's something I think is
So
also
one caveat to asking. So there is research that shows, particularly with engagement surveys, that it's better not to do an engagement survey if you don't plan to follow through on any suggestions or recommendations. So you've got to do it with the understanding that you're going to put some dollars, resources, time, attention, and follow through with recommendations. Because if you don't, and I get it, some companies, they might not be at the right stage, they might have different priorities, they might be a sinking ship that needs to really focus on, one area of the business, which is, growth rather than, or like revenue rather than, other priorities. But it is a lot of that chicken and the egg situation, right? And so I think when you are going to be asking these questions, really make sure that you have people that are assigned to taking the time to work on projects, giving them a budget, setting aside some resourcing to be able to manage the questions, but also the recommendations that come out of this. And, you might get some really great ideas that can double, triple your ROI, down the line. But you're not going to know, and you're not going to find out unless you have that resourcing there. It's not just a matter of asking and then, ghosting your employees. And then that's where all the frustration bubbles up. Like, hey, I asked for this and I don't understand what the point was of asking if there was not going to be any follow through.
no.
We have a couple of minutes left, and I think we wanted to touch on the topic of the tokenism trap. So,
Yes.
Opal, do you want to unpack that for us a little bit?
Oh gosh, yes, the tokenism trap. We all know about going to a company website and, seeing just, particular faces. We also know what it's like to walk around the office and it's pictured in, it's like, oh, here's a diverse person. So it's like, wait, I know you're gonna put me on
Diverse person.
Exactly. It's also
Yeah.
another problematic term, but I just remember walking around even my college campus of someone with a camera, and it's like, oh shoot, I know they're gonna come ask us for a photo to be the person. And so avoiding the tokenism trap, again, making sure you have leaders that understand that that's not okay, making sure that you are bringing in the right people to advise, and making sure you have the right people at your table to be like, this is not what we do, making sure you has that understanding. And so I think it starts, again, the way that I'm contextualizing the tokenism trap is, again, I use the front page of the company website as an example, because we all know that too well of, you're going to make us look good. And so if a company is working towards, becoming inclusive, hopefully they don't just post all of their Black and brown folks on the front page of their website, because that's, that is extremely problematic. And so just having that awareness would be my
right
at the moment, because you'll kind of know, you'll use your intuition. Again, I've looked at company websites and I've been like, I can tell that, this isn't done in earnest. Like, I can tell that they're just trying to, make it seem like this. But if it's genuine, I think that you'll definitely know as a candidate. But what are some things that you've seen, Neha? Because I'm sure, again, it's like, oh,
totally,
you're diverse. Let's use you as the spokesperson. And it's like,
yeah, there's two parts to this. One of it is the photo ops, as you mentioned, but the other part is expecting your Black and brown employees to be the ones to do the work. And, unless they're stepping up and asking and volunteering and wanting to take on this role, do not volunteer. Is where I'll go with that. Do not volunteer. And I think more than anything, it's more courteous to offer or acknowledge that, okay, we realize we don't have an ERG that represents XYZ community. If you would like, to come together, we would love to maybe start an application process for ERG leads. And that way you're inviting people who already have this desire to be an ERG lead versus, just kind of tossing the responsibility to anyone perhaps top performer, right? A lot of the times top performers get called in the mix here, and it might not be something that they want to be focusing on, right? They have other priorities perhaps. And so I think, you have to be the one leading the charge if you want to be an ERG lead, or if you want to have your photo on the career website or any other campaign. If you're leading the charge, that's empowering, that's awesome. If someone else is telling you, that could be a little bit problematic, especially if it's not something that you want to be doing, and you're just being asked simply because of the way you look or sound. That is problematic. And so I think that's another thing with ERGs, is it allows these communities, there's more substance behind the initiative. So on a careers page, rather than just some empty photos, there's an actual story, some initiatives, some outcomes, there's substance there. And it's not just like photo ops. But then again, going back to ERG leads kind of leading the charge and being able to advocate on behalf of their communities, rather than there being some sort of top down, hey, you look this way, or you sound like you know a lot about this topic. Can you write, a comms piece for me? That's really unprofessional behavior, but we've seen it from a lot of leaders who just simply don't know what they're doing. They're afraid, they know they need to do something. But, I think that's where the importance of relying on your ERG leads rather than going straight to their community can be helpful.
And one more thing I'll add, and then in the last few minutes, is making sure you're paying your ERG leads, because a lot of times this work, we're focusing on our work from 9 to 5 respectively, but then, sometimes we're forced to work later hours or go to different weekend events. And so making sure you're fairly compensated. I know that that's something that, is fair, but a lot of and people might be hesitant to join because it's like, I'm doing all this extra work and I'm not fairly compensated for it. And so having that transparency from the leadership level, again, being fair within how much extra you're giving, because in this case, a lot of folks are salaried. So it's like, I'm not going to get paid extra anyway, but hey, making sure that you're getting paid for the work that you're putting in is also might be a little, I haven't seen it happen per se, but I think it's an important thing to make sure.
So I know that many companies will allot a budget for, community programming, events, and some consulting. I have started to see some companies also do what you're saying here, Opal, which is offer a stipend for additional duties. But I think going back to what you said around transparency, let's say that a company simply does not have the budget or cannot offer a top up or a raise or a bonus, or if this work is not going to be acknowledged in their performance review, another thing to keep in mind, right? Like if this is seen as duties outside of your day-to-day, then companies need to explicitly communicate that, and they need to say that this is voluntary. While we acknowledge, your efforts, this is voluntary, and this will not be tied to your performance rating or any bonuses. Like you need to state that, otherwise it sets the wrong precedent and employees are kind of left in the dark as to, where their priorities are and where they should focus the most. So I think if you really want a community to be successful and to go far, definitely pay and tie it to performance. But if you're not in that place for whatever reason, just be clear about it, be transparent about it.
And one more thing I'll add on that is if that's the case of like, hey, we're not going to necessarily be able to pay our employees for their ERG work, let your VC know that. Again, a lot of these startups are VC funded. And so VCs see like, hey, we'll give you your millions of dollars for, your day-to-day operations, but you might need a couple million extra for your ERGs. That could also be a selling point for you. So again, having that transparency, not only with your employee base, but also with your stakeholders is something, again, might be a little more new age, but possibly allocate for more funding. But I know we're at time. I want to leave space for a few questions and see if you had any last minute thoughts, Neha, as we wrap up.
Yeah, this was absolutely great. I think I learned a lot and it got me thinking. So I appreciate all the thoughts. And thank you, Rashonda, for jumping in and sharing your own experience. Any last thoughts from you?
Oh, from me?
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that this is the first of many kinds of conversations. You got the wheels turning. Again, it's interesting to kind of compare where the DEI/ERG space was pre-2020, seeing where it is now today, not only post-COVID, but now with like the mass layoffs. I'm really curious to see how companies are going to navigate ERGs. We know all of Twitter at the moment, lost Black.
Yeah, with Blackbirds.
One of the ones that I know personally, I looked up to as like the gold standard of what an ERG was at one time. And so that was like a huge loss, a huge disappointment. So I'm just curious to see how ERGs are going to continue to expand, not only within the remote work culture, that's a tongue twister, but now with the mass layoffs and even people going more independent. So more to come. I'd love to explore this conversation maybe 6 months, 12 months, 18 months from now.
Definitely.
I'm so open to continuing to learn and to continue to create these conversations. So
definitely. And I think you had a couple of resources. Would you like to maybe just add them to the chat?
I can add it to the chat. And then if you send a follow-up email, Neha, I can send those to you async as well.
Good.
Because I'm always reading. I also like to say within the DEI space, we're always learning. We're always it's a continuous thing. And that's why the whole finger wagging notion of like one person is right versus the other. Some of us have been in this space longer, but we're always continuing to learn, whether it's through articles, conversations like this, books, all of the things. And so I'll share from my own canon, but I'm also curious to what other folks have. And so, we're all here. So I appreciate it.
Love it. So we'll send out those resources along with the recording. And on a final note, Rashonda, any last words from you?
No, thank you so much for having me. This has been an amazing discussion, and I really, really appreciate both your perspectives. So I hope to join you again on your next go around.
Maybe we can do an event together because Rashonda like
sounds wonderful. Totally open. Totally looking here to learn and absorb and bring it back full circle. So I appreciate you having me and thank you for cueing me into the conversation. I wasn't expecting it, but I appreciate it anyway.
That's why we love brave and safe spaces like these. So hope to see you on the hiring community as well.
Of course. Thank you.
All right.
Alrighty. And thank you to everyone else who was listening. And we'll see you next time. Alrighty.
Cheers.
Bye.